Hey there, welcome to That Dang Dad. My name is Phil, and tonight I want to talk about the death of Elizabeth Windsor, Queen of the Andals, the Roynar, and the First Turfs. Except that's not really what I want to talk about tonight. It's just a starting point to get at a deeper idea. I want to talk about politeness and decorum and how those things can be weapons, maybe even violence. And I want to talk about why it's so important to destroy those weapons. So for a content warning, I'm going to be talking about some powerful dead jagoffs and giving some passing examples of their jagoffery. We'll be touching briefly on topics like racism, colonialism, and the covering up of sex crimes. However, this is not a historical video, so I'm not going to catalog all or even most of the crimes of empire, not because they aren't important, but because other people can do it a lot better, and it's kind of outside of the scope of this chat. So anyway, let's get into it. On September 8th, 2022, Elizabeth II, reigning Queen of the British Commonwealth, passed away in Balmoral Castle. She'd been queen for 70 years, meaning that for most people alive in Britain and her colonies, Queen Liz was just a fixture of the modern landscape. She was on the money, she was in the news, she was inevitable. Though prime ministers and parliament ran the day-to-day in the UK, the Queen was like a kind of a mascot or a kind of a figurehead for the living concept of Britain to some extent. And for most of my lifetime as someone in the US, she seemed like a kind of benign curiosity from a country with quaint old traditions. The UK was the land of castles, so of course they had a kindly old queen kind of puttering around a palace and petting peacocks or whatever it is queens do. I think many Americans think of the British monarchy the way that we think of Disneyland castles. Ornate facades for children and tourists to look at. Pure aesthetics and entertainment. But of course that's not true. The Queen had real power and influence, and she was party to some absolutely disgusting chapters in UK history. She was monarch when Britain brutally suppressed the Mau Mau rebellion in Kenya via concentration camps and torture in the 50s. Many believe she personally ordered troops to suppress the Yemeni rebellion against British colonizers in the 60s. And she was head of state during the Troubles in the 70s, when once again a rebellion against British colonial rule was met with heavy-handed violence and corrupt gerrymandering. This is to say nothing of the fact that the Queen's monstrous net worth and vast property holdings, about $25.5 billion, was largely wealth that her family stole from their colonial victims and leached from the British working class for decades before her. Academics estimate that the wealth the British Empire stole from India alone was in the neighborhood of $45 trillion. Now, you can quibble about whether the Queen directly issued orders to do this or that. Frankly, we don't know because, like Prince Andrew's pedophilia, it's all kept top secret by willing lackeys. But I ask you this. Knowing how slavishly the UK political class clings to traditions and propriety, do you think these violent displays of British power would have happened without permission from the lady in whose name and under whose banner those displays occurred? Her face is on the money and you're telling me she couldn't have stopped colonial atrocities happening under her watch? Come on. But like I said, this video isn't about Queen Elizabeth II, and I'm not the right person to litigate her legacy. What I want to talk about is what happened the day she died. People fucking partied. While being scolded by British political operatives and the British media, but I repeat myself, millions of people from Scotland, Ireland, India, Kenya, and even Britain herself cheered, cracked jokes, posted irreverent pictures, and just generally made it a great day to be on Twitter, even better than 30 to 50 Feral Hogs Day or that time Trump got COVID. And very serious people got very upsetty spaghetti about the mocking celebrations. And these very serious people generally had one of two reasons why this glee was inappropriate. The first is obvious. Liz was a human being, and it's never a good look, they say, to mock the death of a fellow human. She was a daughter, a mother, a wife, and a cousin, including both to one very lucky gentleman. She had family who loved her, and we should respect Liz the human being, even if we don't agree with the actions of her country. The second is a little more complex. Some very serious people claim that Liz deserves credit for presiding over an era of rapid decolonization in the UK. That she was gracious as colony after colony liberated itself from Britain's grasp. That she was the face of the peaceful retraction of empire. Heck, she even shook hands with the guy responsible for blowing up her child rapist cousin, Lord Mountbatten. To tap dance on her grave is to ignore what a nice queen she was. Regardless of which camp they were in, the message from very serious people was clear. Now was not the time to speak ill of the dead. It was unseemly, uncouth, inappropriate, rude. It was the most destructive force in modern liberalism. It was impolite. And that's what I want to talk about tonight. For defenders of the status quo, like conservatives and liberals, everything has its appointed time and place. I mean, that's what the status quo is. The people with power marking off territory, setting up schedules, letting you know where you'll be needed, letting you know what's off limits to you. From MLK's marches and Vietnam demonstrations in the 60s, to the disabled Capitol crawl in 1990, to the George Floyd protests in 2020, lots of people get really upset with you when you have the audacity to demand change outside of approved hours, or lacking the proper paperwork, or in ways that cause traffic to back up. Many people shake their heads and give you a pitying look and say, "I feel for the protesters, but this just isn't the way. It's too soon. It's not the right time. We shouldn't be politicizing this. And besides, all this commotion isn't the right way to get things done. Change happens in the system. They need to focus on voting in November instead of making all this ruckus and scaring potential voters. It's just hurting the cause, you know?" Martin Luther King observed this in 1963 when he wrote,
"I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizens' counselor or the Ku Klux Klaner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, 'I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action,' who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by a mythical concept of time, and who constantly advises a Negro to wait for a more convenient season."
The status quo is frequently, I would say predominantly, a site of negative peace, where the top-down distribution of power and prestige is never seriously threatened. And duh, it's designed that way by people in power and enforced by those who aspire to power. Sure, you can protest, just make sure you get the proper forms and be sure to disperse the moment a cop gets scared. By all means, petition your government, but don't ever bother them when they're having dinner at a restaurant. Just the fact that the concept of an illegal strike exists tells you all you need to know about who writes the rules and what they're written to protect. This use of propriety to protect power manifests in other ways, too. In their workbook Dismantling Racism, Kenneth Jones and Tima Okun talk about how many organizations are organized around what they call white supremacy culture, meaning norms and standards that aren't chosen proactively by the group, but are nevertheless used to elevate some at the expense of others. Check out two of the components of white supremacy culture that they call attention to. Fear of open conflict. People in power are scared of expressed conflict and try to ignore it or run from it. When someone raises an issue that causes discomfort, the response is to blame the person for raising the issue rather than to look at the issue which is actually causing the problem. Emphasis on being polite. Equating the raising of difficult issues with being impolite, rude, or out of line. The right to comfort. The belief that those with power have a right to emotional and psychological comfort, another aspect of valuing logic over emotion. Scapegoating those who cause discomfort, equating individual acts of unfairness against white people with systemic racism which daily targets people of color. As someone working in the corporate world these days, I promise you, this culture is alive and well at any place I've ever worked. And there's a few obvious reasons for this. For one, people who've risen to power in these environments know how to work them. They have their system down. Anyone complaining about the structure is threatening to change the rules, forcing people climbing the ladder to have to readjust or possibly fail to thrive in the new normal. Also, the myth of meritocracy tells people that they worked hard and they earned what they have through pure gumption and good character, that they're entitled to be proud of their position in life. To expose flaws in the system, to show that some people benefit at the expense of disabled or racialized people, is to threaten the self-image powerful people have of their own expertise and moral behavior. To attack the system is to attack their self-esteem. Lastly, many times the issues being raised cannot be easily solved, and certainly not by an individual manager. By bringing attention to it, you've now burdened someone with an issue they might be expected to raise to their boss, knowing that they work in a culture that punishes people for raising issues. Thus, it's often easier and safer to dissuade powerless employees from making waves than it is to stick your neck out for them. Yet another example of how systems perpetuate themselves even if individual nodes in the system disagree. Of course, politeness is often used at the individual level in some insidious ways too. Sabrina N. Ross is a professor who instructs pre-service teachers at a predominantly white Southern university. Many of her classes discuss systemic racism and white supremacy. In a 2013 paper, she described a trend she noticed with Southern white women in her class. Student resistance is not new to me, but the way students resisted in this class was. Rather than openly challenging the curricula I presented, students engaged in seemingly benign acts of politeness. They smiled, nodded eagerly, and applied liberal doses of yes ma'am when communicating with me. When I received my teaching evaluations, the same students who had been quiet and polite wrote comments that critiqued my personality, teaching methods, and even my suitability for employment. For example, one student suggested that my course content belabored the theme of white oppression. Another student implied that the content I introduced was not meaningful and critiqued the lack of inspiration and positivity I provided. As a final example, one student indicated that I did not belong in teacher education and referred to me as a wonderful person, I am sure, but not made for teaching future teachers. Later in the paper, Professor Ross, referring to a 1993 paper by Cheryl I. Harris, says the following. Harris argues that whiteness operates as a form of property entitling those classified as white with rights of functional whiteness. Of these rights, rights of disposition, rights to use and enjoyment, rights of reputation, and the absolute right to exclude, Harris's discussion of the rights to use and enjoyment of whiteness as property is most relevant for this discussion. To connect my metaphor of traveling through southern white space to Harris's notion of whiteness as property, my teaching, which challenged racial privilege along with other forms of injustice, challenged students' use and enjoyment of whiteness as property. I was, in effect, trespassing on these students' property rights of whiteness. Their strategic silence was one response to these challenges, and their negative course evaluations were another. Strategic silence and negative evaluation. I mean, are those not the quintessential weapons we deploy to keep the white status quo just the way that it is? And are these strategies of resistance not perfectly concealable within politeness and propriety? After all, if you can't say something nice, don't say nothing at all, right? And hey, what's wrong with a little constructive feedback? With this in mind, we can get a fuller picture of why very serious people are so vehemently against a refusal to respectfully mourn the dead billionaire in charge of a state crime syndicate. Very serious people not only benefit from the status quo, they tend to make their money reinforcing it. Calling into question the legitimacy of Queen Liz's legacy is to create conflict where these people make their bones, and it denies them their right to feel comfortable and respectable. After all, they're playing by the rules. That absolves them of the responsibility to think about who wrote them and who those rules were designed to suppress. Likewise, if Queen Liz functioned as a kind of personification of Britishness, calling her legitimacy and morality into question is a trespass against the right of the British public to use and enjoy their Britishness uncritically. When people in a dominant group become accustomed to their dominance feeling natural and unquestionable, exposing the artificiality of that dominance feels like a vicious attack on their innermost being. In her book, White Women, Race Matters, Ruth Frankenberg says that whiteness refers to a set of cultural practices that are usually unmarked and unnamed. Being unmarked can be an effect of being dominant. When the world revolves around you, it's everything else that needs to be marked, categorized, and explained in relation to you. Late in the book, she writes the following. If the cultural dominance of whiteness were complete and unquestioned, it would perhaps go entirely unnamed. However, there are constantly struggles over the inclusion and exclusion of specific groups of people, as well as over white domination, whether it's structural, institutional, or cultural. In times of perceived threat, the normative group may well attempt to reassert its normativity by asserting elements of its cultural practice more explicitly and exclusively. Naming whiteness as a cultural terrain, albeit a complex one that interacts with a range of other constructs, is a vital aspect of questioning and delimiting its authority. This is the lens through which I, as an outsider, view the protracted state-enforced period of mourning, particularly the suspension of certain state services, the cancellation of surgeries and cancer treatments, the suppression of even mild protests, and so on. Capitalism is in crisis in the imperial core. Well, everywhere, really. All the neoliberal gizmos and gadgets that were supposed to keep it going are falling apart. The very serious people who went to the good schools and lived in the safe neighborhoods and enjoyed the nice side of extractive colonialism are discovering that their comfort and their confidence were built on lies and massive exports of suffering. The emperor's naked dick and balls are on full display, and more people are getting a not safe for work eyeful. This is why the entire United Kingdom must grind to a halt and bow down to an old corpse. This is why decorum is so important right now. It limits the horizon of the thinkable for the masses waking up to the raw deal they've been getting. In the UK, it's plainly obvious that the monarchy has no reason to exist in modernity. Nobody can seriously believe that a family has magic blood that entitles them to a gold chair, a jeweled hat, and all the swans in Christendom or whatever. In my own country, it's plainly obvious that the entire political class has been bought off by the wealthy, and that they don't make a move without permission from their handlers. Nobody seriously believes that, say, the Supreme Court is made up of principled, dispassionate jurists with magic blood that entitles them to a job for life, telling people what they get to do with their uterus. Those in power know what it took to build that power and what it takes to maintain that power. And it all starts with a compelling, distracting story. The story of America. The story of Britain. National heroes, national glory, national pride, tradition, legacy, honor. A great story covers over a multitude of sins. And that's why it's not polite to raise issues, to articulate harms, or to interrogate a legacy. That threatens the official story. It's not the right time for that. And if very serious people have their way, it never will be. If you followed my channel for any length of time, you know that I try to keep a certain vibe going. I don't do debates, I don't do takedown videos against streamers or other content creators. I try to stay fairly gentle even when I'm talking about topics that I'm really passionate about or highlighting crimes and atrocities that infuriate me. I do this because the internet is already full of venom and bombast, and I just want to create a chiller, alternative place to work stuff out. So on the face of it, I'm sympathetic to the idea that mocking someone's grandmother as she dies feels a little unchill. Much of my politics is animated by the notion that all human life is precious and that all human beings deserve dignity. So I completely understand why partying over the death of an old woman makes some people feel uneasy. But the other notion that animates my politics is this. You should question the stories told to you by the rich and the powerful. You should be suspicious of those at the top because they design and defend the systems that govern your life, and those systems are used in turn to benefit those designers and defenders. In my opinion, one of the most politically radical things you can be is curious. Curiosity makes you wonder why something is the way that it is. It invites you to dig deeper and get to root causes. And it delights you by uncovering what was hidden. Conservatism and neoliberalism, but I repeat myself, are inherently incurious ideologies, partly because they work best when everyone just shuts up and plays their part, but also because they operate on so many unquestioned assumptions about the world that allow them to operate with confidence. Meritocracy exists and separates deserving winners from losers. Free market competition is the best way to drive innovation. The rules are here to protect you. Hard work will be rewarded.
The people in charge earn and deserve their place at the top.
Curiosity throws a little wrench into that operation when people set out to investigate whether, say, profit-motivated free markets really do drive innovation and really are the best model for distributing necessary goods. Curiosity exposes unpleasant truths when people set out to discover, say, what the rules were actually designed to accomplish, or exactly how power was concentrated and protected. So if you're already a naturally curious person, awesome. Nurture that. Lean into that. Be ever more fearless and ever more dogged in your search for the truth. And that applies to what you hear on my channel too. Be curious if I'm telling you the truth. Don't just take what I say as gospel. It's okay to be suspicious of me and my influences too. But even if you're a curious kitten, meow meow, so much of modern life is predicated on the incuriosity of the masses. So how can we make our friends and neighbors curious too? There's lots of ways. You could have interesting conversations over a shared meal. You can send them YouTubes or TikToks or PDFs that you come across that you find interesting. You can invite them to spend time with you in a different part of town with different kinds of people than they're used to. But sometimes, in some circumstances, you can do something else. You can refuse to be polite. So much of modern life happens around these little rote rituals that we do, blessing each other when we sneeze, making small talk in the work break room, answering fine if the cashier at Trader Joe's asks how you're doing, even if you're currently suffering from poison, scarlet rot, and frenzy. Violating these rituals can be an instant attention grabber because it shakes people out of the mindless ritual and into a state of alertness. And what's a more audacious ritual to violate than a solemn funeral procession? In the case of Lizzie Windsor, or Antonin Scalia, or that one Koch brother, or Henry Kissinger, please, for Christmas, speaking ill of the dead is a refusal to participate in the assertion of normativity. Yes, death is the great equalizer swallowing king and peasant alike. But in life, some people cause so much suffering, we're the architects and leaders of systems propagating so much evil, that it is a moral imperative not to allow their deaths to render them benign. Systems of oppression thrive on being thought of as normal, as just the way things are. They thrive on being unmarked. Talking shit about dead monarchs and politicians and billionaires is another way of marking these systems, forcing people to see them and, in a subtle way, reminding these people that these systems were built and that we could build different systems if we wanted to. Now, violating decorum can garner attention, but it won't always or even often be positive attention. A lot of people won't like it and won't want to hear it. In my opinion, impoliteness as a political strategy must be employed thoughtfully and tactfully. For example, it is always moral to harass awful politicians and Supreme Court justices when they're eating in a public restaurant with the express goal of making them miserable. But just don't make a mess that the waitstaff is going to have to clean up. Rapist Brett Kavanaugh's address is allegedly public. Just make sure that whatever you allegedly do doesn't mess up his neighbor's yard. And this should go without saying, but there is never a tactical reason to use racist or ableist slurs. Just don't do it. If we're being strategic though, sometimes a critical mass of negative attention is exactly what it takes to uncover what was hidden. I'm fairly well read and I had never heard of the Mau Mau Rebellion until I heard people talking shit about Queen Liz, for example. Audacity may not radicalize this or that person the first time that they experience it, but it does expand the horizon of the thinkable inch by inch when people refuse to let what is unmarked remain unmarked. Anyway, that was a real jumble of ideas, yikes. Not sure I quite put a bow on that one, but the script is inching past 4,000 words, and that's my cue to wrap it up. What do you think about all this? Has politeness ever been used against you? Have you ever had success violating decorum in defense of your principles? What are your rules of engagement for insulting the recently deceased? Let us know down in the comments. As always, please do all the good YouTube-y things that tell the platform that my video is a beautiful jewel that should be displayed on people's recommended bar. Believe it or not, the likes, the comments, the watch time, it really does convince YouTube to put my videos on people's homepages. But don't just wait for Mr. Algorithm to share my video. You should share with friends, contemporaries, and enemies turned lovers too. Thank you for spending time with me tonight. Hope you got something out of it, and I hope to see you on the next one. Good night.